Despite bombastic titles you may encounter in the media about Iceland returning to paganism, most people, at least theoretically, still belong to either the Lutheran Church of Iceland or other Christian denominations. Heathenry has indeed become more popular, but mind you, we're not really dealing with a revival, but rather with a modern tradition. How Iceland became Christian is a fascinating story of its own, and this is what we'll be looking at today. We find information about the Christian conversion of Iceland in several sources, such as the family and contemporary sagas, as well as Ari Thorgilsson's Íslendigabók, annals or church writings, special sagas about churchmen, like those about the two saintly bishops Thorlak Thorhallsson and Jón Ogmundarson. The lives of the first bishops are treated in the Hungrvaka, a brief church history from the 1200s. A century later, the lives of further bishops from Skalholt and Holar were handed down, almost all writings in the vernacular in Old Icelandic. The church texts don't really focus on the functioning of the early society, but on the establishment of the bishoprics, role of priests, and generally the conversion. We do know that a few settlers converted before Christianization, and some were more or less familiar with the new religion, and no wonder given the amount of cultural contacts of the Vikings with other populations, especially the Celts and Anglo-Saxons. Nevertheless, most of them followed the old ways. Luckily, Christian authors jotted down the poetic and prose Edda, the sources without which our knowledge about Norse mythology would be so much flimsier. What they recorded, though, were mythological narrations beyond which we can uncover some of the mentalities, but how the religion was actually practiced is still out in the shadows. Belief and ritual seemed at any rate to extend beyond just the worship of gods in what we can deem magical thinking, with the natural and supernatural intricately bound together. Public rites, on the other hand, would have been vital for maintaining communities, and unfortunately, we don't know a lot about them. Speaking of rituals, boat graves were also retrieved from Iceland, like the extensive burial from the West Fjords discovered in 1964. The boat contained the remains of 7 people, but it seems that originally only one person was buried here, and the other remains collected from other graves and placed there. The inventory includes beads, a mjolnir, 2 bronze bracelets, a fragment of a dirham, a bronze bell, 2 bone combs, and balance weights. Thor's hammer and the bell and a piece of lead with an inlaid cross are an interesting combination, showing a rather fluid approach on religion, or at least that pagans did not have qualms about other religious objects. This reminds us a bit of a character called Helgi the Lean, who in the Book of the Settlements is said to have believed in Christ, but invoked Thor when it came to voyages and difficult times. The conversion to Christianity paved the way to a new cultural horizon. It was also unusually peaceful and fast, in contrast to the very troublesome one in Norway. Furthermore, the church in Iceland developed with very little interference from the Latin West. It wasn't really the same dominant, overgrown institution like its Western parent. Economically speaking, yes, the Icelandic church helped introduce a coherent system of taxation with the tithe. However, it did not reap a very significant revenue because most of it ended up with the chieftains. Icelandic priests themselves were not really a separate class of society, but subjected to secular rules, and among their ranks you could find influential farmers who wanted to keep their property. So the basic patterns of power and wealth were not fundamentally altered. The chieftains, or godar, built churches on their lands just like they did with pagan temples, or just adding a new building, since usually the old rituals took place in the hall. At any rate, there was no separate jurisdiction for the clergy until at least the 12th century. We can reconstruct what happened based on the account of Ari the Learned in the Book of the Icelanders, the Íslendigabók. Ari wrote around 1120 and was brought up at a farm by Hatl, a man who remembered being baptized by the missionary Thangbrand. There are other sources as well, like some lost Latin sagas and references in family sagas like Njol saga or Laxdöla saga. We know of an Icelander called Thorvald, baptized abroad, who brought with him a bishop from the Holy Roman Empire but didn't really have any success, and then Stepnir's mission, who was sent by Olaf Tryggvason, also failed and he was even outlawed. Then Thangbrand arrived, an experienced missionary who did manage to convert some Icelanders, but also killed some people for having written offensive poetry about him. According to the saga of Njol, at least. All in all, he did not convert the island either. In the Book of Settlements, the Íslendigabók, we often hear about shifting conversions in the sense that some brought Christianity with them, but then returned to their ancestors' pagan practices. We read, for example, that someone called Auð used to say prayers at Cross Hills. She had crosses erected there, for she had been baptized and was a devout Christian. Her kinsmen later worshipped these hills, and then, when sacrifices began, a pagan temple was built there. They believed they would go into the hills when they died. In other accounts, the power of Christianity would be decisive. For example, we are told that Bjarni promised to become a Christian, and afterwards the Hvít River changed its course and made a new channel where it flows now, so Bjarni gained possession of Lesser Tongue down to Grind and Solmundarfjörður. The rituals involved in settling the lands were also diverse. Many were worshippers of Thor, so they would throw the high seat pillars with an image of Thor overboard, and whenever they came ashore, they made their home, while others would bring along consecrated earth and an iron bell and settle after placing the posts of a church. Despite the unsuccessful first attempts, unlike other regions, the transition was quite smooth. You have a pagan majority accepting a Christian minority with a political reasoning as well. Iceland was growing increasingly dependent on the trade with Norway, which was also in the process of Christianization, but in a much less peaceful manner. We have the aforementioned Olaf Tryggvason, who, for example, resorted to forced conversion as well. Iceland, however, being so remote and the living conditions already so harsh, did not really need one more problem to cap it all. So for the sake of peace and rule of law, and in order to increase the potential contacts to the rest of Europe, decided to adopt a new religion. When Norway banned trade with Iceland on religious grounds, and the king even took some Icelanders hostage, Christians in Iceland felt encouraged to stand by their cause. Chieftains started to create parallel courts, raising the danger of a civil war. When skirmishes broke out at the gathering, the Althing, the Icelandic mentality kicked in. Mediation and arbitration, treating the conflict like a feud and searching a way to settle. The law speaker, Þorgeir, a Gothi from the northern quarter, was a pagan but also had close ties with Christians, so both sides accepted his mediation. The people of Iceland accepted his decision on the grounds that if law was to be divided, then peace would too. Chapter 7 of the Íslendigabók states quite clearly that everyone was to convert and be baptized, but people were allowed to sacrifice to their old gods as long as, well, essentially no one would snitch on them. The conversion thus should be regarded as an official act. What you did on your own farm was your private decision. You could continue worshipping the old gods, just not at the official gatherings. There was no formal structure to verify if you actually adhered to Christianity at home. This means the process would indeed have been gradual, especially until the Grógos was written, the Grey Goose Law, where we do find the canon law with all kinds of interdictions about the practice of magic, for example, about the practice of seidr. Furthermore, without Christian scribes and scholars showing a deep interest in the pagan past, at least in the mythological stories, we would know much less today about the Norse pantheon and cosmogony, despite all the problems the poetic and prose Edda carry along. It was Christianity which brought literacy in the Latin tradition among the wealthier classes, and without this development, we cannot reimagine the sagas. This was indeed an oral society before, and committing information to writing is also reflected in the first census done on the island, initiated by Bishop Gissur, where they essentially counted the farms. While this whole story might strike us odd, given the manner in which Icelanders usually settled conflicts with procedures and compromises, resolutions, that actually fits the general picture. By reaching this compromise, Icelanders opened up to Western Europe while at the same time maintained a strong connection to the past. for all intents and purposes, they really dreaded societal upheaval more than any other religious change. What do you think? Was it a wise decision? Write your opinion in the comment section. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this history, and there is plenty of material about Iceland on the channel, so if you like, join me in exploring Old Norse culture in all its diversity. This was Irina, thanks for watching or listening, and till next time.